So here in Wisconsin, we feel pretty chuffed that we've got a constitutional amendment that protects voter ID. And we feel pretty chuffed that President Trump has an executive order that is supposed to protect the federal elections, at least. Will Flanders, I have a question for you from Wisconsin Institute on Law and Liberty. Do we have to trust that the Wisconsin Elections Commission and the Evers administration implement rules that assure that these two orders are followed?
Yeah, it's a good question. Good morning. As you said, the constitutional amendment passed last year with 71% support. So that's bipartisan, right? There were folks that voted the other way in the election that still think that non-citizens shouldn't be voting. So we have this amendment on the books. It's passed in a bipartisan way, and the governor has a legal obligation to enforce the amendment. But to date, we've seen no action to ensure that non-citizens are registered to vote and are voting in our elections. In our new policy report that we put out yesterday, we sort of laid out a process for that to happen. And if the governor refuses to do so, then we think the legislature should use their power to do some of the same things.
So how does this work? Well, the governor is going to sit on his hands. I'm not expecting that he won't sit on his hands. Who would be the entity that would be expected to force the governor on the issue of the state constitution? That would be the attorney general. And the attorney general is too busy trying to put my friend in prison so that he can get advantages over people like Francesca Hong in a GOP or in a Democratic primary. So if it's Josh Kaul, then it's up to the legislature. Now, how does the legislature assert its authority and force compliance with the Constitution and the executive order?
Yeah, our assessment is pretty much the same. Obviously, the governor has the primary obligation. There could be the potential, for a legal case to sort of force him to take action, but that's a high legal bar. I've been told by the attorneys on our staff it'd be a hard case to make. So for the legislature, we think a good entity would be the LAB, the Legislative Audit Bureau. And what we could do in this state is essentially compare our voter registration list with the list that the DMV has of those that are non-citizens that have a state ID. You find the matching names on those lists, and then thanks to the fact we have the Trump administration in office who's actually willing to work with states on this, you can send that to Homeland Security and confirm non-citizen status for those folks. So after you do that, you can do some extra checks, then remove those, ultimately get those folks removed from the rolls is the goal. Without the governor's participation, that's challenging, but the legislature and LAB could make those numbers known and put more pressure on to ensure that those folks are removed.
Okay, so we don't cross-check our voter registration with our DMV. Now, if people remember 2 summers ago, the Evers administration flatly refused, said it's an issue of privacy. We don't want to cross-check voter registration with the DMV. So we don't actually do that, even though that's common sense. And so
Correct.
the Legislative Audit Bureau could order this, and we could have this, but still, again, we're basically hoping Tony Evers implements this. That's really kind of terrifying if you think about it.
It is. And, we can look at states like Iowa that have sort of gone through this process. That was our model for what we put out here. And they identified, 277 non-citizens that are registered to vote. 57 of those folks participated. I think it's important to note that, there could be non-citizen participation even beyond, what's noted there. But we'd expect to find, 60 or 70 if we had a similar rate in Wisconsin of non-citizens participating. That number sounds small. Again, it could be larger. But essentially what you're saying, even if the number was that small, and again, that's a minimum, 70 people are essentially being disenfranchised that are legitimate voters because of these non-citizens voting. That's obviously problematic. And, we ought to be thinking about ways to do this. So all we can do from the legislative perspective is, put pressure on. Obviously, we have an election next year, and if this audit takes place and the numbers are exposed for the state, it could become a political issue, and we can potentially get someone in place who would make changes and would act to get those folks off the rolls.
Yeah, so the legislature is basically powerless, is kind of what we're saying here. They'd have to take it to court. It would be difficult to win in court, especially in this court with the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So if the legislature had to act, we are at the end of the line of options before the upcoming election. And if Evers doesn't act before the upcoming election, or the Legislative Audit Bureau doesn't act before the upcoming election, oh well, right? It's kind of what you're saying, I think.
Essentially, it is. It's not a no. I wouldn't like to say, oh well, it is a problem, but it is essentially we're in the in the place where we are at the mercy of the Evers administration. I think exposing this information though still has a purpose, because you're sort of exposing the lawlessness of this administration and allowing this to continue. If the numbers can be identified and we know these folks are on the voter rolls, there's really no excuse not to take action at that point. So. There's at least a small chance that the pressure could be large enough to make them take action. We wouldn't hold out hope for that, and really we're sort of looking at how we could make this an issue, make it known, so that folks know this is what they're voting on, among many other things, during the next gubernatorial race.
It would absolutely the mind boggles that the DMV, which has state ID and driver's license information, isn't providing that information to cross-check with Wisconsin Election Commission's maintenance of the voter rolls, which we're not allowed to see unless we want to pay $12,500 to see them. It blows my mind this just isn't already ongoing. It also blows my mind that we are not cross-checking other states' voter registrants like some states do to make sure we don't have people who are on the borders who are popping across state lines and possibly registering to vote in two different states. All of these real simple checks can be accomplished by, basically running the cross check against Wisconsin IDs. And we don't do it, right? We just never do that.
And the claim is it's a privacy issue, but we're not asking for this data to be made public. We're asking for these checks to happen internally within the government. There's no privacy issue created when two government entities check their records against each other.
Right.
As you say, it's common sense. And even if you're someone who doubts some of the election integrity issues, you ought to want to see these numbers. If they're really low, well, then you've made your point. If they're high, then you ought to want to change them, because you're seeing there is a problem with your sort of belief that elections are secure.
Yeah, agreed. If you guys are right, if the Democrats are right, then you can dunk on us all day long, right? I mean, this is great for you. It's really odd that nobody wants to see this. But you've got President Trump's executive order. You've got the Wisconsin Constitution on the constitutional amendment on citizenship. We've got voter ID in Wisconsin. These three things, should be layups, no-brainers. But we have someone sitting in the East Wing, a Wisconsin Supreme Court that is disinterested in the law, and an attorney general who is making every decision based on his future political career. I'm just not optimistic. I do appreciate the time. Will, by the way, has got a real easy, concise, super easy to understand white paper on this everyone should read and share. Will Flanders, as always, thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.